Hey, let me check in with parts 3 and 4, the final parts of the Birch Bark House by Louise Edric. A I think it's 1999, kind of juvenile novel following a Mekwe, little frog whose first step was a hop, uh, through a tough year in her life. And if you're listening to this, this is me in my read along mode. I'll probably do a review of the book overview, but this is just me talking about the final part. So spoilers ahead. And if you want a more general review and you're somehow on this channel, oh, how'd you get here? But I'm going to talk in full about the all of it. So spoiler. So yes, in the last episode, last time I checked in with this book, I was like, oh, we're getting into winter, and I was like afraid that this Ojibwe family in 1847 around Lake Superior um, is going to be visited by sickness, by smallpox, and I was entirely correct. And indeed, um, one of the reasons I was probably also primed for that, other than I'm also reading nonfiction at the moment about really horrible um, lives, life of a lot of Native peoples on this continent in this time, is because at the beginning of the novel we have a little prologue, which it's the thing with prologues is like they can they're like a little separate thing which can seem so far outside of the story that you entirely forget about it when you're talking about it in your first section of the story. Because indeed, in the first section of the story, we opened with it was basically a death island where a whole bunch of people had died of smallpox, and some hunters had paddled by this island and seen all the death, and they had heard the cries of a single solitary baby who had survived but was, growing weak with hunger, but they were too afraid to stop. And one of the people said, like, I'll tell my wife about it. So we get to this section, and I guess that's probably also why smallpox was in my head, is that this family, Mikwe, and her father, mother, grandmother, um, sister, and little baby brother, and Tallow, kind of the kind of tough old bear trapper woman, who's sort of an aunt. Um, Smallpox descends on them. It's through there's traders coming through. One of them's not feeling so good. He dies during the night, and it the whole town, whole village, and everybody comes down with it because these are Native American people, and they do not have the resistance that Europeans would have. And I mean, it was fairly deadly to Europeans, but it was really deadly to them. And they have, at first, it's the older sister, and mother goes in and takes care. And then the mother gets sick, so then the grandmother goes in to take care of them. And it's just like one by one, they go in, and Amikwe um, is there with her little baby brother, who also falls sick, and she goes in and takes care, and is taking care of them all, and the little brother weakens and weakens and finally dies. Um, and remarkably, the family lives are super weak, because this is one of the other things that you hear about these things. It's like basically the people who survive oftentimes starve to death because they're too weak to be able to go out and do all the really robust physical activity you need to do to actually gather food. This isn't, oh, I got better, now I can go to the grocery store. This is like, oh, I got better, now I have to go hunt, I have to go gather, I have to try and find the food. And her best friend also dies, The sister lives. Little Pinch, Big Pinch, the annoying brother, also lives. But the baby brother dies, and that really hits her hard, and she goes through a real kind of sadness over this. A real, you know, is she gonna basically die of grief in a way. Um, but she does work through that. One of the notable things I think I remembering is that her brother burns his feet, accidentally gets his feet burned because they're boiling like molasses into a thing, and it burns his feet badly, and they rush off to get medicine, and McCoy remembers, oh, her grandmother's got this kind of little emergency kit there, and so she takes care of the brother, and really does tend to him, this annoying little fucker, little brother, but she takes care of him, and he's like, and he's fine by the time he gets back, and just like, wow, you're really good at that. My grandmother's like, and she's like, that was like a really good, that actually sort of kind of that perks her up, and she actually has a kind of a better relationship with her brother. At one point, that crow, that's sort of kind of the pet crow finally does. It's like, oh, it's kind of like it's not it's bringing her pieces of wood and stuff like that. It's like, oh, you want to make a mess with me? Well, I'm not a crow. You have to go and find another crow that will love you, that you can be do grows together with. And the crow does go off, and then he does finally come back, and she's like, oh, please come here, come here, and it's like waving and all that, and the crow's like and it's like she realizes, and her brother though stays very still because he realizes that the crow has gone back to wild, and so he stays very still, and the crow lands on him, and instead of teasing her and kind of tormenting her, he does the really kind thing, which is the crow lands on his head, and he just so slowly kind of sidles over to her, and the crow hops off and onto her, and it's like it gives her that, and she really, she thanks him for that. Um, but she's still really feeling blue about her little losing her little baby brother, and it's when Tallow comes to her and at the end tells her, it's like, there's a reason that you were here to take care of them. It's because you had smallpox before yourself. That's why you didn't fall sick. It's like, well, how could I not fall sick when mother falls sick? It's because she's not your mother, because you were that sick little baby on that death island at the opening of the book, and my husband, who was too much of a fucking coward to go and get you, told me. I kicked him out, said I never want to see him again, and I got you, and I brought you to this family for them to raise. It's like, well, why didn't you keep me? It's like, you don't want an old bear woman raising you. That would be no kind of life. But you were there for them, and you took care of them, and that hits her really well. That's a kind of a comfort to her of that. And there's the whole thing throughout the book of kind of like listening to the spirits, listening to the things, and she remembers that I could remember that the birds sang to me when I was a baby there on that island all alone. They were the spirits who were talking to me. And as she thinks about that, she hears the birds now, and she hears her little baby brother as one of those birds, because it is still a baby brother, talking to her. And it's like, oh, she's there, he's there with him. Um, yeah, so it's quite a beautiful, just stirring little story. It's funny how the opener though had completely gone out of my head. I mean, maybe it was there in my unconsciousness, but it was like I'd forgotten it. It's like I was like that little baby. I was like that little baby or that girl. Like I'd completely forgotten that memory until um, the grandmother had told me. So it's like a weird kind of little echoing of how experientially how I experienced the story. It's like I was a little girl, and it's like, oh my god, that happened to me. it's like, oh my god, yeah, that's what's at the beginning of the story. So it's yeah, it was quite delightful. I think I also really appreciate this story because it depicts a really hard and brutal life, but also depicts a beautiful life, a beautiful, um, rich, deep, deep life. Um, just something to kind of remember when you're kind of going through history books and it's kind of reciting all the death toll and stuff like that. It's just like, oh, I think here's something that's touching and real and human and beautiful and not awful, even though it's still depicting pretty awful stuff. But, you know, these are human beings, which in some ways makes, all the carnage that much worse because you think, yeah, all those numbers I listened to, those are other human beings. Those are another Makeways, little frogs, big hop. Yeah. So, on that upper and downer of a note, I will stop here with The Birch Bark House by Louise Edric. Yeah, really great, really good story. I'm really glad I read that. Sort of reminds me in its a little bit episodic way of something like the Great Brain books, and apparently also Ingrid Wilder. And her Little House on the Prairie books, but I've never read them, so I wouldn't know because I'm a boy. I'm an annoying little pinch or big pinch, and not a really cool um, McWay or yeah. So I will leave it there at that embarrassing conclusion. But good night. See more videos later.